Well, hello everyone and welcome to Insight. Once upon a time, Turkey was seen as a potential member of the European Union, a thriving Muslim democracy, a potentially stabilizing influence in a critical region. No longer. Since the attempted coup of 2016, Turkey's President Recep Erdogan has taken the country on an increasingly authoritarian path. Is also waging an aggressive foreign policy with the help of one of the biggest armies in the world. Today, we're looking at where Turkey is headed, and just what does it want? Our guest today is the Istanbul-based journalist Ayla Jean Yackley, a correspondent with the Financial Times and a contributor to many other publications. Hello and welcome, Ayla.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, you're there in Istanbul, we're here in Calabria, so this is an unusual connection for us. We're usually broadcasting from our home on the Welsh borders, so fingers crossed everything's okay. We'll come to everyone's questions in about 20-25 minutes. Don't forget to put your questions in the box below here as we develop our discussion. You can type away those questions as when you want. And then Isabel will come to you a bit later in the program and we will open your microphones. Let's just remind ourselves, Ayla, I think that it's quite easy not to have thought about Turkey for a while. The US dominates the news so much. Let's just go back 4 years, back to that coup, which really is a sort of a key point in recent Turkish politics. What happened?
So in July of 2016, a faction of the military sought to overthrow Recep Tayep Erdogan, and it was quickly put down, but not before at least 250 people were killed. And that ushered in a new period for Turkey. The government used its emergency powers following that uprising to purge not only the military, but the bureaucracy and other parts of society, shuttering civil society organizations, banning newspapers, jailing journalists. The main culprit, according to the government, in that coup attempt was the Gülen movement, a sect whose leader is based actually in the United States, Fethullah Gülen. They had been quite powerful and close allies of Tayyip Erdogan for most of his rule, but had a falling out in, I would say, about at least 6 years or so before the coup attempt happened. And Erdogan not only directed those emergency powers against members of the Gülen movement, but also other groups, other parts of the opposition in Turkey, and that includes the Kurds, I think most predominantly, but also leftists and other perceived enemies. And in that period, since 2016, it has been quite tumultuous. Erdogan was able to hold a referendum in 2017 that vastly empowered his office of the presidency. He assumed that new post in 2018, consolidating power. And it's been a pretty, as I said, it's been a consolidation of power with some blips from Erdogan's perspective. And I think it's worth mentioning here that last year there was nationwide local elections in which cities elected mayors. And for the first time in 25 years, the opposition wrested control of Istanbul and Ankara from Erdogan's ruling party, which had dominated those cities and several others. So that created a little bit more oxygen in the room for the opposition. So. Okay.
Let's just go back another step. Can we just remind ourselves of who Erdogan is and how he represents a shift in Turkish politics? If we think of Turkey dominated, yes, by the military, but also by the legacy of Ataturk, the strong state, the Republican Party. Erdogan comes to power. He's a sort of strong man from Istanbul, but also he's an Islamist. He's conservative, but he's at that point, if you think about the 2000s and that sort of area, he's not seen as a threat to democracy, but there's a question mark put over it.
That's right. He does hail from Istanbul. In fact, he was mayor of Istanbul 25 years ago when his party, which has its roots in political Islam, came to power. And that's sort of how he carved his path to the national stage. He suffered under the previous regime, let's say, under the strict secularist and military dominated regime. He was jailed briefly in the 1990s for reciting a poem that was deemed too Islamist. But there was a pretty dramatic financial crisis in 2001 in Turkey, and Turks revolted and elected Erdogan, gambled on him essentially. He came to power with 30%, roughly 33% of the vote back in 2002, or his party did. He had to run in a by-election stemming from that prison sentence. He wasn't allowed to run in the 2002 vote. And the old guard, the secular old guard, did warn the masses that they were electing a wolf in sheep's clothing, that he was an unrehabilitated Islamist, and that he would drag Turkey in the direction of, say, Iran. But he completely distanced himself from that and positioned himself as a pro-European Union reformist, primarily on the economy. He wanted to liberalize the economy, but he also wanted to expand civil rights for Turkey's Kurds, improve the situation for women, usher Turkey into the 21st century. And for the first part of his rule, he really just dramatically changed Turkey. But over the course of 17 years, he has scuttled many of those sort of reformist ideas and has swerved sharply towards a more nationalist position. And as I mentioned, he has vastly consolidated power, and that's made it, I think that's also clearly affected his ability to see through reforms. He's now more interested in preserving his own power.
And it's worth, I mean, I'm thinking back to the 2000s, Turkey was actually quite seriously taken as an EU candidate. It still officially is. But in 2007, France and Germany stopped, blocked that in its tracks. And I think then last year, all negotiations was stopped altogether. So the idea that Turkey could be an EU member is so far out there. It's not something people talk about anymore.
That's true. That was a real hallmark for Erdogan early in his rule, that he opened formal negotiations with the European Union. You're right in that these center-right conservative parties in Europe opposed such a large and poor, in comparison to Western Europe, country entering the bloc. But Turkey also shoulders responsibility for the failure in those talks. It stopped its reform process. It's failed to meet the human rights criteria that the EU sets out for potential members. And again, the swerve towards nationalism also has made the project a lot less appealing to Erdogan. The idea of surrendering sovereignty to the European Union is something that doesn't appeal. And then it's also worth mentioning that the European Union has changed in this period as well. And it's distracted, to say the least, by Brexit and a conservative, more religious, and in some ways more authoritarian Turkey just doesn't sort of suit the European Union the way it may have a more liberal EU 15 years ago.
Yeah, you're talking about the human rights thing. I think, has Turkey adopted capital punishment? I know they were promising to do so, but have they actually done it?
No, they have not. Yeah. They abolished it. They hadn't used it since roughly around the time after the 1980 military coup. And then they formally abolished it in the early 2000s, again, to meet even very basic preliminary criteria to join the EU. And Erdogan has floated the idea of reviving it over the years, but it's not really being discussed at the moment. And it's not something that, as far as I know, that they're actively pursuing it at this time.
Okay, well, that's a great recap. I think that sort of brings us up to date. Let's look at what's been happening over the last few months. Obviously, with the pandemic taking place, politics all around the world has been shaken up. What's been happening in Turkey?
I think it's one of the most significant developments over the last few months is economic. Turkey is undergoing a record contraction in the second quarter at the height of the coronavirus outbreak, when Turkey, like other countries, introduced social mobility restrictions. The economy contracted by about 10%. That came on the heels of a dramatic slowdown that took place beginning in 2018. Erdogan has, one of the reasons for his popularity is that he's overseen incredibly fast growth in Turkey, but it's been credit-fueled growth, and it's coming due now. And so over the last 2 years, in addition to Turkey's perceived political risk surrounding Turkey because of its poor relations with the West at points, there has been a flight of capital from Turkey. And so I think it's important to say this because it has clearly affected politics, as the economy always does, and has undermined support for Erdogan. I mean, he's still Turkey's most popular politician, but we're seeing opinion polls showing that his party's support is down to about the levels or even slightly below what it first saw back in 2002 when it was elected, so historic lows. So that's been very dramatic. So high unemployment, high inflation. The lira has lost about a quarter of its value against the dollar and the share alone, coming on the heels of a sharp decline in 2018 and 2019. And so that's really dominated the domestic agenda, let's say. But it's everything's sort of wrapped up, whether it's domestic or external. And so Erdogan has been accused of trying to distract attention from this financial crisis, and has instead focused attention on some of its overseas issues. That takes us into foreign policy. I don't know if you want to step into that right away.
Let's step on the foreign policy in a moment, but I think it's
Okay.
worth, I remember going to Turkey in the 2000s, and then from after the financial crisis, and even then this massive construction boom taking place. And the question at the time was, when's this going to be paid for? And now you're saying, well, that, the crunch is happening now, and the political fallout is happening now. Just before we go into the foreign policy area, which is, there's a huge amount to discuss there. Yeah. Can you talk about what's actually happened at home? So going back to the coup, there were, as you said, after the coup, there are about 150,000 people detained, huge wide-scale arrests. So Erdogan's clearly not afraid to put who he wants to in jail. What's been happening during COVID? Because there are some regimes around the world that have used COVID as an opportunity to clamp down on the press, for example.
So early in after the outbreak, after the virus reached Turkey, the government actually introduced an amnesty and released, the number escapes me now, but a huge portion of the overcrowded prison population, but not political prisoners. So they remain behind bars, and they include probably most notably leaders of the Kurdish opposition, but also human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, a philanthropist, and other members of civil society, as well as politicians. So we haven't necessarily seen a serious escalation in sort of the clampdown that has been ongoing. I think that the government has, it is obviously, trying to tackle this outbreak like other governments elsewhere. It's had to keep its economy largely open during COVID. It tried a kind of hybrid approach by having lockdowns on weekends, keeping people over the age of 65 and under the age of 15 inside 24 hours under 24-hour curfew to try and reduce the spread. But then by the beginning of June, and it began to normalize, as it described it, and allow businesses to reopen and lift these restrictions. And so there has been, quite a bit of a spread. And it might be worth mentioning here that just yesterday, the health minister acknowledged that the numbers that they've been sharing on the coronavirus outbreak for at least the last 2 months, haven't included all cases because they'd been accused of underplaying the number of cases, but just those who show symptoms. He didn't say how many cases there are in Turkey, but he did say that that they only count those who are being treated in hospital or at home, but are being treated for it. So that I mentioned that to show you that, just to try and explain that the measures taken to combat coronavirus have been quite mixed. Turkey has a low death rate, but the spread continues. But I think that's a problem everywhere, including in Western Europe and the United States in particular. So just to go back to your original question, I wouldn't say that we've felt a terrible increase. I mean, certain communities have. The Kurds, again, have taken the brunt of it. Just last week, late last week, the last mayor of a large provincial capital who had been elected by the HDP voters. HDP is the pro-Kurdish left-wing opposition party. The last city that they controlled, that mayor was detained. They won 65 mayoralships in 2019. They now control, I think, 7 small towns, to give you an idea of the scale of the crackdown on the Kurdish political movement here. So they've definitely suffered. And the opposition mayors in other cities have also been restricted in how they've responded to the coronavirus outbreak, with the government insisting that it has to be a centralized effort. But it also probably stems from the fact that these mayors are popular. They've been successful in dealing with the needs of people, and there seemed to be an effort to sort of rein that in.
Okay, let's make that pivot, which you were suggesting earlier, the distraction from domestic politics by foreign intervention. What's happening?
So a number of things are happening. It's just a really dynamic and shifting environment beyond Turkey's borders. So maybe we should start sort of chronologically. In October of 2019, last year, Turkey launched its third intervention into Syria, this time targeting a Syrian Kurdish militia that had aligned itself with the United States to fight Islamic State. Turkey was worried that this militia had made too many territorial gains and that could potentially stoke separatism among its far larger population of Kurds. So Turkey did that, much to the chagrin of the United States, the European Union, and even Russia, which has a complicated but cooperative partnership with Turkey, despite being on opposite sides of the Syrian conflict. So that was an event. That was followed just less than 6 months later with another incursion into Syria, this time against the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad's forces in the province of Idlib, which is the last opposition stronghold in Syria and is largely backed by Turkey and borders Turkey. There are more than 3 million civilians who have sought refuge in this province in Idlib, and any attack by the regime out of Damascus or the Russians who are supporting them militarily would force another wave of refugees. Turkey hosts more than 4 million Syrian refugees. And whether it's its economy, whether it's sort of social cohesion, says it can't take any more. So Turkey considers that very much part of its sphere of influence.
So that just on those 2 points, that seems to be sort of natural defense of national interest, making sure that the Kurds don't get too strong, and making sure that you're not being swamped with refugees. But then if we turn to Libya, there seems to be something else going on.
Sure. So Libya is happening almost concurrently, beginning in January, after striking a deal with the UN-recognized government in Tripoli that had been besieged by a rebel commander from the east of the country. Turkey signed a deal with this with the internationally recognized government, and began supplying it with military support. At the time, it seemed a bridge too far. Turkey is in some sense a maritime neighbor with Libya because they share the Mediterranean Sea. but it's quite a distance away. And I think it also worried Turks, who saw it as a potential imbroglio. I mean, getting involved in Libya is no cakewalk. However, Turkey's decisive entry into that conflict did rapidly shift the tide in favor of the government of Prime Minister Sarraj. But it also angered traditional allies. Initially, the U.S. was a bit reserved about it. That they seem to be the exception. They've sort of come around to Turkey's role there, seeing Turkey as a bulwark against Russia, which supports Sarraj's opponent, but also on the side of Sarraj's opponent, Hiftar, is France, the UAE, Egypt. So it's like a lot of conflicts, there's multiple actors and it's very complex. I think it's important to note that a very significant motivation for Turkey to get involved in this was that the agreement that it inked with the government in Tripoli created an agreement on a maritime border between Libya and Turkey that essentially runs through waters claimed by Greece. And the reason why this is significant is that Greece and Turkey are locked in actually a long-running dispute about what demarcates their continental shelf. But Turkey has been largely sidelined by Greece, Egypt, Israel, the Palestinians, Lebanon, did I mention Egypt, who are dividing up much of this area to exploit potential natural gas under the seabed. And Turkey had long considered itself absolutely essential to any exploitation of these hydrocarbons, because any pipeline that's destined for Europe would most logically go through Turkey. But when these countries, especially Israel, found it difficult to negotiate with Turkey, they decided to look for other options. And so, as I said, Turkey has been sidelined. But that agreement with Libya gave momentum to Turkey's territorial claims in the Mediterranean. And that could lead us to another foreign policy development, if you like.
Oh, I'm just going to go on, but before you get onto it, but also there's a sense there that Erdogan sees himself as a sort of regional hegemon, that he was ideologically supported the Palestinians, he's clashed with Israel. So there is a sense, a projection of himself playing a role within the Middle East, that he's standing up for Arab rights, and also pitted against the UAE, Egypt. He's trying to offer an alternative.
Absolutely. I mean, this really crystallized with the Arab Spring, in which Turkey supported these movements, some of them in the region that were Muslim Brotherhood linked.
And he would sympathize with the Muslim Brotherhood. There's a similar sort of origin in a way to his political beliefs. Yeah,
to his political views. I mean, he's by no means a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, but he has, at the very least, a degree of sympathy for them, especially after the crackdown in Egypt, in which the Muslim Brotherhood effectively was thrown out in a coup. He supported the uprising in Syria early on, in which the Muslim Brotherhood was, was a key player in the revolt against Assad. And that has put it at odds with several, powers in the region, from Egypt, clearly, to Israel, to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But Erdogan very much casts that support, even if it's not material, at least moral support, for members of the Brotherhood, including some who have found refuge, Egyptians who have found refuge here in Istanbul, as a popular political Islamic movement, which kind of traces his own rise to power as well, and against sort of authoritarian regimes from Egypt to Saudi Arabia.
And one shouldn't forget the killing of Khashoggi and the embassy in Ankara as well. That's a key thing.
Yeah, that was 2018, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The days sort of bleed into each other. But yeah, Khashoggi, a sharp critic of the Saudi monarchy, was killed, and under in a pretty grisly way, according to Turkish intelligence leaks, who seem to have pretty close to firsthand knowledge of what happened to him. And that obviously Turkey's response to that murder, which I think was a mix of shock and disgust, and also anger that Saudi Arabia would do something like that on Turkish soil. Turkey was vociferous in its response and its criticism of Saudi Arabia, and that has only complicated those already strained relations with places like Saudi Arabia, but also the UAE, which had already looked at Turkey with suspicion because of its perceived support for the Brotherhood.
Okay, there's so much to talk about, and we haven't finished yet on our introduction.
Yeah.
The next is Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Ngorno Karabakh, where, as we speak, there are Turkish troops.
Yeah, I've had my head down for most of today in another story, so I haven't been keeping tabs on that closely. There are Turkish troops in Azerbaijan that have been there that predate this latest conflagration, supporting and training Azerbaijan's military. Turkey and Azerbaijan are easily the two closest allies that each other has. They share linguistic and even ethnic ties. So Turkey's been a long supporter of Azerbaijan. But what was interesting was that the first hostilities that erupted this year, back in July, Turkey did depart from its usual more cautious stance in which it urged for a peaceful resolution, and instead came right out and blamed Armenia for the start of the violence. It's done that again. Just one second, sorry.
Don't worry.
There was a call coming in. Just one. So Turkey had really just discarded any sense that it could be some sort of arbiter or peacemaker, despite its close relationship with Azerbaijan. It's also a member of the so-called Minsk group, which is trying to broker, since the early 1990s, a resolution to this conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But it instead, has promised support. I don't know. The last that I saw, the Turkish Defense Ministry denied Armenian allegations that its soldiers and its aircraft were involved in the latest fighting. But Turkey has its finger in there to some extent as well. Okay.
I'm going to invite everyone to start putting questions in. We've got some questions up here already. One from Howard Gates, who can't actually come on the microphone. So I'm going to take his question to start with. If other people could start putting their questions in, that'd be great. So let's talk about the relationship between Erdogan and Putin and the Turkish-Russian relationship, because Russia's fascinating. It seems to be backing both sides where it can, so it can have hands in as many puppets, controlling as many puppets as possible. But can you just talk a bit more about how Erdogan perceives Putin, and then also the relationship between the two countries?
Turkey has gone to great lengths to cultivate a good relationship with Russia after having a real rupture in ties back in 2015, or was it late 2014? I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact time now. I think it was late 2014. Turkey downed a Russian jet over Syria and had been exchanging, sharp words with Russia over its support for Assad. That event was responded to with ferocity by Putin diplomatically. It cut trade with Turkey, and it's a really important trading partner for Turkey. And
well, I think Russians are building nuclear power stations in Turkey as well, aren't they?
They are. They're Turkey's main supplier of gas, of crude oil, of coal, and now they're building Turkey's first nuclear power plant. in southern Turkey. So they're a really, really important partner for Turkey. They also send the most tourists to Turkey. They buy Turkish agricultural products. So they are essential for Turkey. But I think when the coup happened in 2016, Turkey not only felt that the West didn't come to his support quickly enough, there's plenty of people in his inner circle who actually think that the US at least had some role in it as well, since they host Fethullah Gulen, the cleric whose movement's blamed for the coup. But Erdogan, Putin and Erdogan had made amends in the days before the coup, and Putin was quick to phone Erdogan after it happened to express his support for him. So they have a bond, let's say, and that's to explain why Turkey has expended so much effort to keep its relationship with Russia on good terms, because they diverge on so many strategic issues. They're on opposite sides of the conflict in Libya, in Syria, in the Caucasus, which is Turkey has largely viewed as Russia's backyard. These are former Soviet republics. Turkey's sort of much more animated and strong response to it is something that could anger Russia if it feels that Turkey's going too far. Turkey's a member of NATO. It has a troubled but still strong relationship with the United States. But some of the ways that Turkey has gone about trying to improve and retain that close partnership with Russia has been through weapons procurement. Turkey has purchased a weapon system, the S-400s from Russia that are designed to shoot down NATO aircraft. And this has caused a huge amount of problems for Turkey in its relationship with the West. Turkey says are not yet operational, but they are out of the box, apparently. And for the US at least, they are operational by all counts. And Turkey faces sanctions from the United States for helping Russia's arms industry by purchasing those missiles. It's only down to Trump and his close relationship with Erdogan that has prevented those sanctions from being implemented.
Yeah, that's reminded me of the images of Erdogan's visit to Washington and his security detail. The head of the security detail has a brief chat with President Erdogan. I think, I'm not too sure if was he president at the time or Prime Minister? I think he was president.
He was president, yeah.
Yeah. Outside the embassy, and the head of the security detail just has a quick word in his ear, and then suddenly all their guards who are deployed near the embassy start attacking and beating up these protesters. Quite amazing, quite stunning images, and indicative of his heavy hand, perhaps. Let's start bringing in some questions with microphones open. So Philip Godfrey's got a good question. It's a pretty specific question. Philip, do you want to go ahead?
Well, can you hear me, Nicholas?
Yeah, good, clearly. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, if only it was specific, actually. But Ayla, you've got Erdogan juggling Russia, NATO, but we haven't talked much about the Sunni Shia schism, if I can call it that. Azerbaijan, one of only 4 countries in the world that is majority Shia. Assad, Alawite minority, but Shia oriented. Iran, Shia, and Turkey, Sunni, largely. Does that firstly play into the politics of the region? Or is Erdogan trying to step above all of that with this sort of, man of the people in that area? I'm just interested how that split plays out, because it does in other parts of the world.
It's true. It's something that it definitely informs Turkey's relationship, at least with Iran, in that Iran, while Turkey cooperates with it in several areas, including in the, it's also a major energy supplier for Turkey. And Turkey opposes the US-led sanctions against Iran. That religious divide informs the relationship. They, like a little bit sort of like Russia, they are competitive partners, or is one way to look at it. That religious difference with Syria is much more pronounced. Erdogan has, evoked Assad's Alawite creed over the years when he's, ranted and railed against him. So it can be a factor, but Turkey is pragmatic as well and can turn an eye to that. I don't think it's those issues aren't as present or as pressing for Turkey as they might be for, say, Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm keen to get some voices coming. I know there are people who've been to Turkey here recently. I can see somebody in Texas who's logged in, who Ayla knows. So if I think we'll get Elliott. I'm going to pick on Elliott. So let's put Elliott Jeter up there, so we can get him to put a question. When we were having discussion earlier, that Ayla, I was asking, how do you define what Erdogan wants? I mean, in the way you've actually described it so far, you've clearly laid out what are reasonable national interests, and he's just using the military to implement many policies. It's obviously a distraction from domestic politics, very cleverly keeping close to Putin. Is it just sort of self-preservation? Previously we would think that he was a sort of conservative Muslim, but orientated around building the economy up, and you could sort of get an idea of where he was going. Where is Turkey going? What's it all about?
Oh gosh, I probably won't be able to justify that. Great question. I mean, I think that it's a combination of factors. I mean, the world is changing, the region is changing. During the 4 years of Trump's presidency, the U.S. has sort of withdrawn from the region, Turkey's longtime stalwart ally, and so perhaps Turkey sees a vacuum that it has to fill. And you're absolutely right that a lot of what it is going after are perfect, from Turkey's point of view and from the point of view of national interest, it's clear. Turkey's very much a rational actor. It's just that I think the main difference is that in the past, what Turkey would turn to its alliances. It would turn to NATO. It would turn to the United States to help it achieve those interests. And now Erdogan is relying much more on the military to do that, partly because those alliances are not as reliable, perhaps in his view, partly because of the changing external dynamics with a Europe that is focused on its own issues, the US focused on its own issues, and then these new rivalries that have emerged. There's, a lot of just, Erdogan himself likes to evoke Turkey's past imperial glory when it ruled the Mediterranean seas. It, had its empire stretch. Yeah. The Ottoman legacy. The Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna all the way to the Indian Ocean, and for him, at least in his the narrative that he presents to the public, that's a factor as well. This idea that Turkey was a great power and it can be a great power again. Its population of 82 million people in this area that borders so many different regions, bestow it with a singular role, and that it's his job to fulfill that destiny in some ways. So at least, I don't know how much, it's impossible for me to know how much of that informs his decision making, but that is oftentimes what's presented to the public.
Yeah. And the key thing that there's the big void in the Middle East because the US is essentially sort of withdrawn from the area. So there's a sort of a big political void there. Let's bring in Diane Cook. Diane's not up yet. So Elliott's got his microphone. So Elliott, go ahead. Elliott.
Hello, Ayla.
Hi, Elliott. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for your wonderful tour of Istanbul.
Well, I'm hoping that you'll step in and answer a few questions too,
No.
because you were here so recently. I'm sure you could. I'm sure you can.
I'm going to interrupt you.
I-
Turkey is one of the places where, I mean, there are a few places around the world where we can operate tours, and we have Ayla very kindly showed Elliott around Istanbul and gave him a good sort of political briefing. So now Elliott is an expert and fully qualified to answer all our questions. But go on, Elliott.
I don't know about that, but we did spend after we left Istanbul, we spent 10 days down the Aegean Sea in extraordinary, lovely cities and met some incredibly friendly people. And my question to you is, and I think you warned us about this, we met exactly 0 pro-government people and anti-government passion. The anti-government passion on the Aegean Sea is, it reminds me of the anti-Trump crowd here in the States. So you told us that would happen, and it certainly did. There was no exceptions.
Wow,
and,
that's interesting. No exceptions.
Because a while back, it's very difficult to have a conversation. We stopped having tours in Turkey because we just felt it was too difficult to have these kinds of conversation. But now this sort of criticism of the government and Erdogan in particular is open.
It's still difficult and it still runs risks, but the restrictions don't seem as severe as they were during that period of emergency rule between 2016 and 2018. So there is a loosening, what Elliott is talking about is really interesting and really important. And that analogy you made to sort of Trump, the divisions over Trump, really do resonate here. Everything down to the fact that it's the coast here in Turkey, where at least the Aegean and the Mediterranean, not the Black Sea, that's very much still Erdogan country, but the western part of the country does support largely supports the secular opposition. And then in the southeast of Turkey, which is predominantly Kurdish, they overwhelmingly support the HDP, which I mentioned. So there is that. But I think that, that's another significant point is that, yes, it's never been that you can't express unhappiness, especially at the polls. I mean, electoral democracy, despite all of the sort of impingements on democracy that we've had here, Turkey still has elections, and by most accounts, they're largely fair. Again, except for maybe in the southeast in particular. But there is a space, there is a valve that you can open in Turkey to express discontent. There are restrictions. The parameters are set by the government, how much space the opposition or the opposition supporters can operate in, but there is space. And I think that's really important to understand. I mean, this isn't North Korea or Saudi or even Saudi Arabia or even Iran. I mean, it has a long tradition of electoral democracy. It's been an imperfect democracy over the decades, but it does have an opposition. It's just when you get into the nuances of it, how free they are to operate is another question.
Okay,
I think our friends told us that. Sorry, our friends told us that we met. Told us you can certainly speak freely at a cafe, at a restaurant, but you got to watch what you put on your social media.
That's very good point.
And there was one story about one of the gentlemen got a stern warning from the government about I believe his Instagram post. So the warning was heeded and never done again. So it's a serious issue.
That's true. It's true. That's a really good point, actually. Social media in particular is very sensitive for the government. Media in general is. 9 out of 10 newspapers and TV channels are either owned by the government, run by the government, or by companies that are close to the government. So media is not a free space, but absolutely, like at the cafe, people still feel to some extent, I mean, they might be more careful than they used to be, but they still are able to criticize the government. And that's a really important distinction.
Okay. Diane Cook is a good follow-up question to this. Go on, Diane.
Hi. This is a plug for political tours, because our visit in November 2011, right across the country from west to east.
Wow.
And practically when I follow Turkey, everything I heard on that trip has happened. So my question is, so Erdogan has got to the point where in 2011, what people were saying will happen has happened. What does the future hold for him? Because he wanted, for example, at that time with neighbours, it was all about friendly relations with neighbours, which perhaps has moved on because of circumstance. But what does he want to do in the next period of his control?
That is a great question. There is a lot of speculation about it. And I think that's because he's achieved the main goals that he set out. And in particular, that is a US style executive presidency. I mean, it's actually on steroids compared to the US in terms of how much power is concentrated in the presidency now. But that for a long time was his stated aim. And, I think probably what people were telling you in 2011 was that, he wants full control. I think that to remain in power is clearly his goal. And it seems like it always has been, I guess, with hindsight, being 2020. I think back now, and I realize that even as early as 2005, 2006, he never really, I couldn't, even back then, I couldn't really imagine him ever in the opposition again, like in a traditional parliamentary democracy where he would, serve for a period and then, return to the opposition and then maybe contest, an election in the future. Like he clearly now always had the intention of overseeing, of being in control for all these years. And that's partly because the project that he's undertaken is so big and is so vast and so historic. And some of those things, he really has fulfilled a lot of those goals. A really significant one was to relax the restrictions on the expression of Islam in the public sphere. Turkey had, prior to Erdogan's election, Turkey had several restrictions on that expression. One of the most sort of painful ones for a lot of Turks was a ban on the headscarf, the Islamic style headscarf, which kept so many women out of university or jobs because they weren't allowed to wear it in state offices. So that was a pledge. It took him 10 years to deliver on that pledge, but that's something that he brought in. This summer, he reverted the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral, Byzantine cathedral, and then mosque under the Ottomans. He reverted that back into a mosque. It had been a museum over the last 70 or so years. So that's another thing. So that elements of that project are still ongoing, but he's really achieved a lot of what he set out to do and a lot of what his supporters elected him to do. Yeah. So I didn't really answer your question because it's something that I think about and I wonder, because he has done so much and really changed and transformed this country so completely. I'm not sure what more he wants to do.
I think it's worth adding that during his time in power and his governments in power, Turkey has transformed dramatically, and also the economy's transformed, and people are far wealthier than they were, substantially better off. So I think most Turks would recognise he has a significant impact on their lives, and not just the veil.
Absolutely, no, that's I think the most dramatic change. I mean, I mentioned the role of religion in society, but I think much even outstripping that has been the economic change. I mean, he's tripled the size of the economy since he came to office, and people who knew, very desperate poverty and in their lifetimes now have a lot of the advantages and blessings that you see, that come with well, you know, consumerism. You know, they have refrigerators and clothes, and you know, it's just incredible what he's been able to do. There's fears now, as even among his own supporters, and that's why we've seen his approval ratings declining. That some of those gains are being undone by his management of the economy over the last few years.
Yeah. Okay. Let's bring in Annie McMahon in the form of Simon Jackson. Do not be deceived by the beard and glasses there. This is a sweet voice that's going to come online. So hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Given, I've always been baffled by Turkey's wish to play a mediating role in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Is there any prospect? Well, like the reason is because I wonder if there's any prospect for a normalization of relations between Turkey and Armenia. For example, is there any prospect of a properly open border?
And just to follow up on that, one mustn't forget that one of the key tripping points for negotiations with the EU was the EU's determination that the Armenian genocide should be recognized, and that Turkey obviously wasn't going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was never part of the formal requirements by any means, but country after country in Europe, France, Germany, Switzerland, and others, Italy, have all recognized the genocide of up to 1.5 million Armenians beginning in 1915. That has always haunted the relationship with Armenia. But over the years, sporadically, both sides, Armenia and Turkey, have been able to put aside the trauma that not only that, you know, catastrophe has created, but also from Turkey's perspective, having to sort of fend it off because Turkey denies that it was a genocide. It's haunted the relationship, but both sides were able to, at times, put it aside for pragmatic reasons. Most recently, is not that recently, was back in 2009 when the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton helped broker a set of protocols that would have seen normalization between Armenia and Turkey, which share a border, and that the closure of that border by Turkey, and I'll explain in just a second. I'm sure your listener, our guests know why. But I'll get to it. But keeping that border closed has helped impoverish Armenia, and has kept it very much in Russia's embrace as well. But Turkey briefly recognized Armenia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but quickly cut those ties after that area, that enclave of Ngorno Karabakh, which Azerbaijan and Armenia are still to this day fighting over, after it broke off from Azerbaijan. And the international community recognizes that as Azeri territory, but its population was, I think, around 80% Armenian, if I'm not mistaken. And Turkey said when it cut relations that, you know, it was cutting it because of that dispute. In 2009, with Clinton's intervention, Turkey said, we will go towards normalizing relations with Armenia and that issue can be resolved later. Erdogan then sort of scuppered that process when Azerbaijan objected to it, which shows you a little bit about the dynamic that Azerbaijan also has some influence over Turkey, not least because it supplies it with about 1/5 of its natural gas. So I think I went off on a bit of a tangent. Your question was about Turkey being a kind of an arbiter in that dispute. I mean, technically, it's part of this Minsk group, which includes Russia, France, and the United States,
I think
and a
the
few
question
others.
was about the prospect of normalization. So
Okay.
I think you covered it very well there.
Okay, good.
Okay, we've got an interesting question from Sheila de Belaig. So if you could bring Sheila on. I haven't been to Istanbul for a while. Istanbul's a very liberal place, but what about elsewhere dealing with this question? Sheila, go ahead.
Yeah, I haven't been to Turkey since 2013. Wanted to ask, is the headscarf practically de rigueur now in Turkey? And do women get criticized for dressing sort of Western style, short skirts, no headscarf, etc.?
No, it's not. It has the change. The shift hasn't been that extreme by any means. I mean, I think there are parts of the country that are, outside of Istanbul, outside of the western part of the country that are more conservative, and women do dress accordingly. But by no means. I mean, you see images. You see people on the street, mixed groups, young teenagers. A couple girls have their hair covered. A couple girls don't. It's more increasingly a non-issue. There have been isolated, sort of sporadic events that have caused an outcry in which women were assaulted for having a mini skirt on or something like that. But those are one-offs. So those are by, unstable men usually, and not because of the environment. But women's rights activists will say that the tenor and the tone that the government uses when it talks about women do create a climate. Erdogan has said that, careers get in the way of motherhood, which is a sacred duty. He's urged women to have at least 3 children. Sometimes it's 4 children. He this summer came quite close to withdrawing Turkey from the so-called Istanbul Convention, which is a Council of Europe treaty, and it's named for Istanbul because it was signed here in Turkey, and it's a whole sort of framework for fighting domestic abuse and violence against women, which Turkey has very high rates of, mainly by family members, and he nearly withdrew from that. But opposition to it from his own conservative base by women in his party helped, so for the time being, keep Turkey inside that convention. So yeah, it's you would, I wear shorts and I don't cover, and I don't think twice about it when I'm going out. I might feel differently if I were in a conservative town in one of the provinces. I think I would think differently about it, but not in Istanbul now.
Okay, we've got just a few minutes left, Ayla. I want to turn to the US. Do you think it would make a difference with a Biden administration? What do you think US priorities, how might they change in relation to Turkey if there was a change in administration?
Joe Biden has used some choice words to describe Erdogan. There was a bit of a kerfluffle maybe about a month or 2 ago when a video, I think it was an interview with the New York Times, and the video was released in which Biden was critical of Erdogan and called him an authoritarian. Turkey, Erdogan in particular, enjoys very, very good relations with Trump. According to John Bolton's book, his sort of tell-all book from his time in the Trump administration, Erdogan, wields influence over Trump. He was able to get the United States to pull back its military back in October of 2019 so that he could roll his troops into an area and target the Syrian Kurdish militia, which were close allies of the United States. Turkey considers them terrorists because there are links to a homegrown insurgency. So I think Turkey very, very much hopes that Trump is reelected because of this relationship. But in the end, Turkey's and Erdogan, they're very pragmatic. I believe, and I think a lot of analysts will tell you, other analysts will tell you that Turkey can work with whomever's in the White House, despite the ups and downs and the rockiness that kind of seems to more frequently plague the relationship. I do think that we might see more pressure on Turkey. What we might see most notably, it's hard to know for sure, is that maybe there'll be a renewed focus on Turkey's human rights record, which is something that hasn't interested Trump since he came into office.
Yeah. Do you see a shift at all with the conflict in Syria, or has Turkey sort of stabilized its interest there and it's controlling that border with Syria, and things are going to stay? It's hard to tell, I guess, isn't it?
It's really hard to tell. I mean, it depends on the developments. But, Assad has regained almost all the territory that he lost, except for this province of Idlib. Turkey does control about 85 8,500 square kilometers of Syrian territory with its series of interventions. But that withdrawal, that when Trump pulled back American special forces who were fighting with the Syrian Kurdish militia, it wasn't Turkey that filled that vacuum, it was Russia. Russia moved into that area. So the idea that the US could somehow do an about face and, you know, even if Biden would want to, and I'm not sure that he would, return to that area that it had helped kind of create with the Syrian Kurdish militia after Islamic State was defeated, I don't think that's an option. I mean, Russia's there now.
Okay. Ayla, this has been a fantastic conversation. You've taken us across a range of really complex topics, both internally and externally, and I've really, really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.